In the dusty streets of Socorro, New Mexico Territory, 1873, a young woman with child stands before the town barber, her dark hair cascading down her back like silk. Maria Alvarez knows this moment will change everything. Her hair, once her pride, and the envy of every woman in 3 counties, is all she has left to trade for survival. The coins it brings will buy bread for a week, maybe 2 if she's careful. She's 22, alone, and carrying a child whose father disappeared into the desert months ago. The townspeople whisper behind their hands when she passes, their judgment as sharp as the barber's shears. But Maria has something they don't understand, an unbreakable will forged in hardship. When a wealthy rancher rides into town that evening, drawn by stories of the woman who sold her crown of hair, he sees not desperation, but strength. What happens when 2 wounded souls meet in a land where second chances are as rare as desert rain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Socorro's main street as Maria Alvarez walked slowly toward the church, her fingers wrapped around the worn wooden beads of Father Miguel's rosary. The weight of it in her palm brought comfort, a tangible connection to her mother's memory and to the faith that had carried her through darker days than these. Each bead told a story of prayers whispered in desperation, of hope maintained when all seemed lost. Socorro in 1873 was a town caught between the old ways and the new, where Spanish colonial architecture stood alongside hastily built American storefronts, and where the languages of 3 cultures, Spanish, English, and Apache, could be heard in a single conversation. The railroad had brought prosperity to some and displacement to others, creating a complex tapestry of opportunity and hardship that Maria knew intimately. She had been born here when it was still more village than town, when her father tended sheep in the surrounding hills, and her mother sold embroidered goods to travelers passing through on the old Camino Real. Those had been simpler times, when Maria's greatest concern was keeping her hair braided properly for church and learning the intricate stitches that would one day make her a suitable wife. But time had a way of reshaping dreams as surely as wind reshaped the desert landscape. Father had died when she was 16, kicked by a horse he was trying to break. Her mother followed 2 years later, worn down by grief and the constant struggle to make ends meet. Maria had been left with nothing but the small adobe house at the edge of town, her sewing skills, and the kind of beauty that drew both admiration and trouble in equal measure. That beauty had drawn Diego Morales like a moth to flame. He had arrived in Socorro with a silver tongue and promises of a better life, speaking of land in California, where the climate was gentle and opportunities abundant. Maria had believed him, had given herself to him completely, body and soul. When she discovered she was carrying his child, she had expected joy, celebration, perhaps a simple ceremony before Father Miguel. She had found an empty house and hoofprints leading west into the desert. Now, 6 months later, her condition was becoming impossible to hide. The loose-fitting dresses and carefully draped shawls could only do so much, and the women of Socorro had eyes like hawks when it came to such matters. Maria had felt their stares growing sharper, their whispered conversations cutting deeper than any blade. Mrs. Hernandez, who ran the general store with her husband, had been the first to refuse Maria's business outright. "We don't serve women of your situation," she had said, her lips pursed in righteous disapproval. "Perhaps you should consider moving on to somewhere more suitable for your circumstances." Others had been more subtle, but no less cruel. The seamstress who had once eagerly sought Maria's intricate needlework now claimed she had no need for such services. The baker's wife, who had gossiped with Maria every Sunday after Mass, now looked through her as if she were invisible. Only a few souls showed kindness. Old Pedro, who tended the church grounds, would nod respectfully when their paths crossed, and sometimes leave small gifts, a handful of apples, a jar of honey on her doorstep. Mrs. Santos, the midwife who had delivered half the children in town, had examined Maria with gentle hands and declared both mother and child healthy. Accepting payment in the form of mended clothes rather than coins, Maria didn't have Dot and Father Miguel, bless his weathered soul, continued to welcome her at morning. Mass, though she noticed, he no longer called upon her to help with the altar cloths or to assist with the younger children's catechism lessons. The small adobe house where Maria lived had become both sanctuary and prison. Its thick walls kept out the worst of the desert heat during the day and the chill at night, but they couldn't keep out the loneliness or the constant worry about what would happen when her savings ran out completely. She had sold everything of value first: her mother's silver hair combs, her father's leather saddle, the good dishes that had been her grandmother's. Each item had bought her another week or two of basic survival, but she was running out of possessions to trade. That morning, as she had brushed her hair before the cracked mirror that hung in her bedroom, Maria had known the time had come for the ultimate sacrifice. Her hair had always been her crowning glory, reaching nearly to her waist when unbound, thick and lustrous as spun silk. Her mother had taught her to care for it with oil pressed from desert wildflowers, to braid it with ribbons on special occasions, to pin it up in elaborate styles that would make any man look twice. Now it would have to become currency. The barber shop sat between the blacksmith's forge and the town's only hotel, a narrow building with a striped pole that had seen better days. Senator Martinez, the barber, was known throughout the territory for his steady hand and fair prices. More importantly, he was known to buy hair from women who needed quick money, reselling it to wigmakers in Santa Fe who catered to wealthy ladies who had lost their own locks to illness or age. Maria paused outside the shop, her hand instinctively rising to touch her braid. Once it was gone, there would be no hiding her circumstances, no pretending that she was anything other than what she was, a woman who had fallen from grace and was now willing to sell pieces of herself to survive. Survival was exactly what this was about. Not just her own, but that of the child growing within her. She could feel the baby moving more frequently now, little flutters that reminded her that she was no longer responsible for just one life, but two. The bell above the barbershop door chimed as she entered, and Senator Martinez looked up from sharpening his razors. He was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands that never trembled, despite the whiskey she sometimes smelled on his breath in the afternoons. "Senorita Alvarez," he said, setting down his tools, "what brings you here this morning?" Maria reached up and began unpinning her braid, letting it fall over her shoulder. "I need to sell my hair, Senator Martinez, all of it." The barber nodded slowly, understanding immediately. In a town like Socorro, he had seen this transaction before, though perhaps never with hair quite so beautiful, or with circumstances quite so poignant. "It's very fine," he said, running the thick braid through his fingers with the professional assessment of someone who knew the value of such things. "The wig makers in Santa Fe will pay well for hair like this. I can give you $15. $15. It was more money than Maria had seen in months. Enough to keep her fed for the remainder of her pregnancy if she was careful. Enough to buy the basic supplies she would need when the baby came. "Cut it all," she said, settling into the wooden chair that faced away from the mirror. She didn't want to watch her transformation from woman to necessity. As the scissors made their first cut, Maria closed her eyes and fingered the rosary beads in her pocket. Each snip felt like a small death, but also like a small birth, the birth of a new version of herself, one who would do whatever it took to protect her child. When it was finished, she felt strangely lighter, as if she had shed not just hair, but some of the weight of expectation and judgment that had been pressing down on her shoulders. The money felt solid and real in her hands, more substantial than beauty had ever been. Walking home through the dusty streets, Maria held her head high despite the stares and whispers that followed in her wake. Let them look. Let them whisper. She had made her choice, and it was the right one. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the Magdalena Mountains to the west, Maria sat in her small kitchen counting and recounting the coins Senator Martinez had given her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think beyond mere survival to actual hope. Perhaps there was still a future to be built, even from the ruins of her dreams. The first drops of rain began to fall as she prepared a simple supper, and with them came the sound of hoofbeats on the road outside her house. Maria glanced through the window, curious about who would be traveling in such weather, and saw a lone rider approaching through the gathering dusk. Even from a distance, she could tell this was no ordinary traveler. The horse was a fine one, well-bred and well cared for, and the man in the saddle sat with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding both beasts and men. As he drew closer, she could make out more details: a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, clothes that spoke of quality rather than flash, and something in his bearing that suggested depth of character forged through experience. The rider passed her house without stopping, heading toward the town's center, where the hotel and saloon would offer shelter from the approaching storm. But as he passed beneath the lamplight that illuminated the intersection, Maria caught a glimpse of his profile and felt an unexpected flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the child she carried. This was a man who looked like he had weathered his own storms and emerged stronger for the experience. This was a man who might understand that true strength sometimes required sacrifice, that survival sometimes demanded choices that others would never comprehend. Maria didn't know his name yet, didn't know his story or what had brought him to Socorro on this rain-soaked evening. But something in her heart whispered that this stranger's arrival might change everything. The storm broke fully as she watched his figure disappear into the darkness, rain drumming against her roof like the beating of hope against despair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new judgments, new struggles to survive in a world that had little patience for women like her. But tonight, for the first time in months, Maria Alvarez allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might also bring something unexpected, something like a second chance. The storm that had threatened Socorro the night before delivered on its promise, turning the town's dusty streets into rivers of mud and sending most sensible folks indoors to wait out nature's fury. By morning, the rain had settled into a steady, persistent drumming that made the adobe walls weep and turned the simple act of venturing outside into a test of necessity versus comfort. Maria had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of the mysterious rider she had glimpsed through her window. Something about him had stirred feelings she thought Diego's abandonment had killed forever not romantic feelings. Exactly, but a recognition that echoed in her bones like a bell struck in a distant cathedral. She woke to find her shortened, hair sticking up at odd angles, a stark reminder of yesterday's sacrifice. Running her fingers through what remained, she felt simultaneously liberated and bereft. The woman in her cracked mirror looked like a stranger older somehow, more serious, stripped of the feminine softness that had defined her. For so long, the baby chose that moment to announce its presence with a particularly vigorous kick, too. Her ribs, and Maria smiled despite her melancholy. "Good morning to you too, little one," she murmured, placing both hands on her rounded belly. "Your mama looks different today, but she's still here. We're both still here." The rain meant she couldn't tend to the small vegetable garden behind her house, and the muddy streets would make walking treacherous, but Maria's dwindling supplies demanded a trip to the general store. She needed flour and beans, perhaps some dried fruit if Mrs. Hernandez would deign to serve her. The $15 from her hair felt substantial in her pocket, but she knew it would disappear quickly if she wasn't careful. Wrapping herself in her mother's old rebozo, Maria stepped out into the gray morning. The rain immediately began soaking through the wool, but she pressed on, picking her way carefully around the deeper puddles and trying to ignore the way her boots squelched with each step. The general store sat at the heart of Socorro's small commercial district, its wooden porch offering some shelter from the elements. Maria could see warm light glowing through the windows and smoke rising from the chimney, promising warmth and the mingled scents of coffee, tobacco, and leather goods that she associated with better times. As she climbed the steps to the porch, she noticed a magnificent horse tied to the hitching post of a stallion with the kind of conformation that spoke of careful breeding and excellent care. Even in the rain, the animal stood with dignity, its coat gleaming despite the weather. This had to belong to the rider she had seen the night before. The bell above the door announced her arrival with its familiar chime, and Maria stepped inside, grateful to escape the persistent rain. The store felt wonderfully warm after the chill outside, and she took a moment to shake the water from her rebozo before approaching the counter where Mrs. Hernandez stood sorting through the morning's mail. The woman looked up with her usual expression of barely concealed disapproval, her lips tightening as she took in Maria's appearance. "I thought I made myself clear about," she began, but her words were cut short by a deep voice from the far corner of the store. "Ma'am, I believe you are about to help this lady with her shopping." Maria turned toward the voice and found herself looking at the rider from the night before. Up close, he was even more impressive than her glimpse through the rain had suggested. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his wool coat and an air of quiet authority that seemed to command attention without demanding it. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, and his eyes, a remarkable shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds shot through with lightning, were fixed on Mrs. Hernandez with an intensity that brooked no argument. "Senator McCrae," Mrs. Hernandez stammered, her manner undergoing an immediate transformation. Of course, I was just, that is, I didn't mean." "I'm sure you didn't," the man McCrae said mildly, "but there was steel beneath the courtesy. Perhaps you could see to the lady's needs while I finish selecting my supplies." Mrs. Hernandez bobbed her head like a bird pecking at grain. "Certainly, Senator McCrae. Right away." She turned to Maria with a smile so forced it might have been painted on. "What can I help you find today, Senorita?" Maria felt a flush of gratitude, mixed with embarrassment. She wasn't accustomed to needing rescue, particularly from a stranger, but she also wasn't foolish enough to reject assistance when it was offered. "Flour, beans, and some dried fruit if you have it," she said quietly, pulling out her money to demonstrate that she could pay Dot as Mrs. Hernandez bustled about gathering her purchases. Maria was acutely aware of the man called McCrae moving quietly through the store. He selected his items with the careful deliberation of someone who knew exactly what he needed, examining a coil of rope here, testing the balance of a tool there. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-sufficiency. When Mrs. Hernandez had assembled Maria's order and accepted her payment with grudging politeness, Maria found herself lingering near the door, hesitant to venture back into the storm, but equally reluctant to impose further on her unexpected champion's goodwill. McCrae solved her dilemma by approaching the counter with his own purchases: coffee, tobacco, several tins of food, and a small bag of peppermint sticks that seemed oddly out of place among the more practical items. "Storm's getting worse," he observed, glancing toward the rain-lashed windows. "Not fit weather for walking, especially for a lady in your condition." The directness of his reference to her pregnancy should have embarrassed Maria, but something in his tone stripped away any sense of shame or judgment. He stated it as simply as he might observe that the sky was gray or the rain was wet, a fact to be acknowledged and accommodated, not a source of moral scandal. "I don't live far," Maria said, though the thought of walking even 2 blocks in this weather made her wince. "Far enough," McCrae replied. He turned to Mrs. Hernandez, who was watching their exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Ma'am, I'll be taking the lady home in my wagon. Please add her purchases to my bill." "That's not necessary," Maria protested, though her heart leaped at the offer. "I can pay for my own goods." Those remarkable eyes fixed on her face, and Maria felt as though he was looking past her carefully maintained composure too, the exhaustion and worry she tried so hard to hide. "I'm sure you can," he said simply, "but I'm offering anyway." There was something in his voice, a gentleness beneath the strength, that reminded Maria of her father, who had been capable of breaking horses, but never raised his voice to his wife or daughter. This was a man who understood that true power lay not in domination, but in protection. "Thank you," she said, the words barely above a whisper. McCrae nodded and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a silver pocket watch that he consulted with the automatic gesture of long habit. Maria caught a glimpse of intricate engraving on it surfaced before he snapped it closed, but not before she noticed the way his thumb traced over what looked like initials carved into the silver. "I'll bring the wagon around," he said, pulling on his hat. "No sense in you getting any wetter than necessary." As he stepped out into the rain, Mrs. Hernandez leaned across the counter with the avid expression of someone scenting gossip. "Do you know who that is?" she whispered, apparently forgetting her earlier hostility in the excitement of potential scandal. Maria shook her head, though her pulse quickened with curiosity. "That's Beau McCrae," Mrs. Hernandez continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "He owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties, thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle. They say he's richer than Midas himself." She paused dramatically, glancing toward the door to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "But he's been a hermit ever since his wife died 5 years ago. Lives alone in that big house of his, hardly ever comes to town except for supplies. Some folks say he's touched in the head with grief. Others say he's just mean as a rattlesnake and twice as dangerous." Maria absorbed this information with growing unease. A wealthy, reclusive rancher with a tragic past. It sounded like something from one of the romance novels her mother had hidden beneath her sewing basket. Not the sort of man who appeared in real life to rescue abandoned pregnant women from judgmental shopkeepers. "Why do they say he's dangerous?" she asked, despite herself. Mrs. Hernandez glanced around again, then leaned even closer. "He was a cavalry officer during the war, they say. Fought against the Apache and the Comanche both. Word is he can put 6 bullets in a playing card at 50 paces, and he's killed men who crossed him." She straightened up, smoothing her apron with satisfaction. "Course, that might just be talk. But I'll tell you this much, nobody in Socorro has ever been fool enough to test him." The sound of wagon wheels and horse hooves on the muddy street announced McRae's return, cutting short any further speculation. Through the rain-streaked window, Maria could see him waiting beneath the store's porch overhang, water dripping from his hat brim as he secured the canvas cover over his wagon bed. "You be careful, girl," Mrs. Hernandez said, her earlier hostility replaced by something that might have been genuine concern. "Rich men don't do favors for women like you without expecting something in return." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, but before she could respond, the door opened and McCrae stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. "Ready?" he asked, his gray eyes finding hers across the store. Looking at him, really. Looking Maria tried to reconcile Mrs. Hernandez's tales of violence and isolation with the quiet courtesy he had shown her. There was certainly something formidable about him, a sense of contained power that suggested crossing him would be unwise. But there was also something indefinably sad, a shadow in those remarkable eyes that spoke of loss deeply felt and carefully guarded. Perhaps they both carried ghosts. Perhaps that was why she felt this strange sense of recognition, this feeling that they were 2 souls who had weathered similar storms and emerged scarred but not broken. "Ready," she said, pulling her rebozo more tightly around her shoulders. McCrae held the door for her, and together they stepped out into the storm, neither of them knowing that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would transform both their lives forever. As he helped her up onto the wagon seat with hands that were strong but gentle, Maria caught the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes and felt something long dormant stir in her chest. Not desire exactly, but something deeper, recognition perhaps, or hope. The rain continued to fall as they set off through Socorro's muddy streets, 2 damaged souls finding unexpected shelter in each other's company, while somewhere in the opposite distance, danger rode closer with each passing hour. The wagon ride through Socorro's rain-soaked streets passed in comfortable silence, broken only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the soft creak of leather harnesses. Maria found herself stealing glances at her unlikely rescuer, noting the easy way he handled the reins and how his presence seemed to calm the horses despite the storm's fury. When they reached her small adobe house at the town's edge, Beau McCrae made no move to simply deposit her at the door and drive away. Instead, he climbed down from the wagon seat and came around to help her down, his large hands spanning her waist with careful consideration for her condition. "Thank you," Maria said, meaning it more than such simple words could convey, "for everything back there." McCrae touched the brim of his hat, water cascading from the gesture. "No thanks necessary, ma'am. Just common decency." If only common decency were truly common, Maria thought, but she kept the observation to herself. She was reaching for her parcels when a particularly vicious gust of wind sent rain sheeting across the porch, and she swayed on her feet, one hand instinctively moving to support her growing belly. "Ma'am?" McCrae's voice held a note of concern. That cut through the storm's howl. Maria tried to wave off his worry, but the world tilted suddenly around her, and she found herself grasping for the porch rail to keep from falling. The morning's walk through the mud, combined with the stress of the encounter at the store and her generally weakened condition, had taken more out of her than she'd realized. Without hesitation, McCrae stepped forward and steadied her with one strong arm around her shoulders. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" he asked, and the directness of the question startled her. Yesterday, I think, or perhaps the day before." The admission came out before she could stop it, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the rain's chill. McCrae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That won't do," he said quietly. "Not for you, and not for the child." He guided her gently but firmly toward her front door, gathering her packages in his free arm as if they weighed nothing. "Where's your key?" Maria fumbled in her pocket, her fingers suddenly clumsy with exhaustion and embarrassment. The key seemed impossibly small and slippery, and she nearly dropped it twice before McCrae's larger hand closed over hers, steadying her grip. "Easy," he murmured, the word meant for a spooked horse, but somehow perfect for her frayed nerves. The door opened onto Maria's small but tidy front room, where a few pieces of simple furniture stood arranged around a corner fireplace that had gone cold during the night. The space felt smaller with McCrae's imposing presence filling it, but not uncomfortably so. If anything, his quiet competence seemed to make the little house feel more secure, as if his very presence were a bulwark against the storm raging outside. "Sit," he said, guiding her to the worn but comfortable chair her father had built years ago. "I'll get a fire started." "You don't need to," Maria began, but he was already kneeling before the fireplace, arranging kindling with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of practical matters. As warmth began to fill the room, McCrae moved to her small kitchen area and began unpacking the supplies he'd purchased for her, his movements economical and sure. From her chair, Maria watched him work and tried to understand what was happening. Men like McCrae, wealthy, powerful men, didn't make fires for abandoned pregnant women or arrange their groceries with careful precision. Yet here he was, doing exactly that. "You have coffee?" he asked, examining her meager supplies. Little." Maria started to rise, but he gestured for her to remain seated. "I'll make it. You rest." Within minutes, the aroma of brewing coffee filled the small space, mingling with the wood smoke and creating an atmosphere of domestic comfort that Maria hadn't experienced since before her mother's death. She found herself relaxing for the first time in months, her hand unconsciously moving to cradle her belly as the baby settled into a peaceful rhythm. McCrae appeared beside her chair with a steaming cup, the coffee dark and rich in a way that spoke of quality beans and careful preparation. As she accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushed, and Maria felt an unexpected flutter of awareness that had nothing to do with pregnancy and everything to do with the quiet strength of the man standing before her. "Better?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup. Maria nodded, not trusting her voice. The coffee was warming her from the inside out, but it was more than that. For the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. They sat in comfortable silence as the storm continued its assault on the windows, each lost in their own thoughts. Maria found herself studying McCrae's profile in the firelight, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way shadows played across features that were too weathered to be called handsome, but were undeniably compelling. There was something about him that reminded her of the mountains that ringed Socorro solid, enduring, shaped by forces beyond human control, but unbroken by them. She wondered what had carved those lines around his eyes. What sorrows had taught him to move with such careful consideration for others' pain? "This is a good house," he said eventually, his gaze taking in the simple but well-maintained furnishings. "Built to last." "My father built most of it," Maria replied. "He believed in doing things properly, even if it took longer." "Wise man." McCrae's eyes returned to her face. "You favor him?" The question was gently asked, but Maria heard the deeper inquiry beneath it. He was asking about her family, her history, the circumstances that had led her to this isolated existence. In stubbornness. Certainly, she said with a rueful smile. My mother always said I had his pride and her heart, which made for a dangerous combination. Not dangerous, McCrae said quietly. Necessary. The single word hung between them, weighted with understanding that made Maria's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. When had anyone last suggested that her strength was necessary rather than inconvenient? What about you? She asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Do you favor your father or your mother? Something flickered across McCrae's features, pain, perhaps, or regret. My father was a hard man who believed strength was the only virtue worth cultivating. My mother. He paused, his thumb unconsciously tracing the edge of his coffee cup. My mother taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show kindness to someone who needs it. The words settled between them like a bridge being built, plank by careful plank. Maria felt her mother's ring, the one she'd hidden away and never sold, seemed to grow, warm against her finger where she'd moved it to her right hand for safekeeping. She sounds like a wise woman, Maria said softly. She was. McCrae sat down, his cup, and reached into his vest pocket, withdrawing the silver watch she'd glimpsed earlier. This time, he didn't hide the engraved surface from her view, and Maria could make out delicate script that read E.M. and a date from 5 years past. Your wife? She asked gently. He nodded, his thumb tracing the initials with a gesture, so habitual it seemed unconscious. Elizabeth. She would have liked you, I think. She had a soft spot for women who faced the world with their chin up, no matter what it threw at them. The admission was clearly difficult for him, and Maria felt honored that he'd chosen to share it. She sounds like someone worth loving. She was that too. He closed the watch with a soft click and returned it to his pocket. But love doesn't always get to last as long as we'd like it to. The truth of that statement settled over them both like a shroud. Maria thought of Diego, of the love she'd thought would carry her through any storm, and how quickly it had crumbled when tested by real adversity. No, she agreed quietly, it doesn't. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, the driving rain settling into a gentler patter against the windows. McCrae rose from his chair, and Maria felt an unexpected pang of loss at the thought of his leaving. I should be getting back, he said, but he made no immediate move toward the door. Will you be all right here alone? The question was practical, but Maria heard the genuine concern beneath it. I've been alone for months, she said. I'll manage. McCrae studied her face for a long moment, and Maria had the unsettling sensation that he could see straight through to her soul. I'm sure you will, he said finally, but that doesn't mean you should have to. Before she could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, he'd gathered his hat and coat and moved toward the door. The rain should ease up by evening, he said. But if you need anything at all, my ranch is 5 miles north of town. Anyone can give you directions. Thank you, Maria said, rising carefully from her chair. For everything. McCrae paused with his hand on the door latch, and when he turned back to look at her, something had shifted in his expression. What's your name? He asked. Your given name, I mean. Maria Alvarez. Maria. He said it like he was testing the sound of it, and something in his voice made her pulse quicken. I'm Beau McCrae. I know, she said, then felt her cheeks warm at the admission. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Small towns, he said with understanding. I'll bet you know half my life story by now. Only the interesting parts, Maria replied, surprising herself with the teasing note in her voice. His smile widened slightly. Those are the dangerous parts to know. With that, he was gone, leaving Maria standing in her doorway, watching his wagon disappear into the gray afternoon. The house felt emptier without his presence, but not in the hollow way she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, it felt like a space that had been filled and would be filled again. For the first time in months, Maria allowed herself to hope that tomorrow might bring something other than mere survival. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but it no longer sounded like tears. 3 days passed before Maria saw Beau McCrae again, though he occupied her thoughts far more than was prudent for a woman in her circumstances. The storm had cleared, leaving Socorro's streets muddy but passable, and life had resumed its familiar rhythm of small cruelties and smaller kindnesses. She had noticed the change in how people looked at her since McCrae's intervention at the general store, where before there had been outright hostility or deliberate blindness. Now there was something more complex, a wariness mixed with speculation. Word had spread quickly through the small town that the reclusive rancher had taken an interest in the pregnant outcast, and nobody seemed quite sure what to make of it. Mrs. Santos, the midwife, had stopped by the day after the storm to check on Maria's condition, her weathered hands gentle as they examined her swollen belly. "The baby is growing well," she had pronounced with satisfaction. "Strong heartbeat, good position. Another month, perhaps 6 weeks, and you'll be holding your little one." The prospect filled Maria with equal parts joy and terror. Joy at the thought of finally meeting the child she'd been carrying and protecting all these months. Terror at the practical realities of caring for an infant alone with dwindling resources. "Have you given thought to what comes after?" Mrs. Santos had asked with the bluntness of someone who'd seen too many women struggle with the harsh mathematics of survival. Maria had nodded, though in truth her thoughts on the matter were a tangle of hope and fear that she couldn't quite sort through. The money from her hair would last a few more weeks if she was careful. But after that remained an open question that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the baby's movements as if they might provide answers to problems that seemed to have no solutions. It was on such a night, when sleep seemed as distant as the stars, that Maria heard the sound of horses approaching her house. Her first instinct was fear respectable. People didn't call after dark, and a woman alone was vulnerable to all sorts of dangers. She rose carefully from her bed and moved to the window. Peering through the gap in the curtains. In the moonlight, she could make out 2 riders, but as her eyes adjusted, she recognized the larger figure's familiar silhouette. Beau McCrae sat, his horse with the same easy confidence she remembered, but tonight he wasn't alone. Beside him rode a man she didn't recognize, smaller in stature, but carrying himself with the alert bearing of someone accustomed to watching for trouble. Maria wrapped her mother's shawl around her shoulders and opened the door before they could knock, not wanting to risk waking the neighbors who already had too much to gossip about. "Miss Alvarez," McCrae said quietly, touching his hat brim in greeting. "I apologize for the late hour, but I wanted to speak with you." "Of course," Maria replied, stepping aside to let them approach the porch. "Please, come in." McCrae dismounted and helped his companion down, a man in his 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "This is Doc Patterson," McCrae said as they climbed the porch steps. "I asked him to ride out with me tonight." Maria felt a flutter of alarm. "Is someone hurt?" "I don't understand. Nobody's hurt," McCrae assured her quickly. "But I've been thinking about your situation, and I wanted Doc to meet you. He's not just a physician. He's also a friend who's good at solving problems that don't have obvious solutions." Dr. Patterson stepped forward with a gentle smile that immediately put Maria at ease. "Miss Alvarez, it's a pleasure to meet you. Beau's told me about your circumstances, and I hope you don't mind my saying that I admire your courage in facing them alone." "I'm not sure I've had much choice in the matter," Maria replied, leading them into her small front room. "There's always a choice," Dr. Patterson said seriously. "The fact that you've chosen to fight rather than surrender speaks well of your character." As Maria lit the oil lamp and stirred the banked coals in the fireplace back to life, she was acutely aware of how shabby her home must appear to these 2 successful men. The furniture was worn, the floors bare, except for a single woven rug her mother had made, and the walls displayed only a simple wooden cross and a faded daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. But neither man showed any sign of judgment. If anything, McCrae seemed more relaxed in her humble surroundings than he had appeared in the general store, settling into the same chair he'd occupied during the storm, as if he belonged there. "Miss Alvarez," Dr. Patterson began once they were all seated, "Beau has a proposition for you. But before he explains it, I want you to know that I've examined his reasoning from a medical standpoint and found it sound. What he's suggesting would be beneficial for both you and your child." Maria looked between the two men, her heart beginning to race. What kind of proposition? McCrae leaned forward, his gray eyes serious but kind. "I'd like to offer you employment. At my ranch. Nothing improper," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "I need someone to manage my household cooking, cleaning, basic organization. In return, you'd have your own quarters, 3 meals a day, and medical care when the baby comes." Asterisk, the offer hung in the air between them like smoke, beautiful and potentially dangerous. Maria's first instinct was gratitude so overwhelming it made her chest tight, but close behind it came suspicion and fear. Men didn't make such generous offers to women like her without expecting something in return. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" McCrae was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered truth. "Because I know what it's like to be alone when you need help the most," he said. "Because my ranch is too big and too quiet, and I think we might be able to help each other." He paused, then met her eyes directly. "And because I think Elizabeth would have wanted me to." The mention of his late wife's name in this context felt sacred somehow, and Maria understood that he was offering her something precious, not charity, but partnership. A chance to contribute rather than simply receive. "I'm not a charity case," she said, needing to establish that boundary even as hope bloomed in her chest. "I'm not offering charity," McCrae replied firmly. "I'm offering honest work for honest pay. The fact that it benefits us both doesn't make it charity. It makes it good business." Dr. Patterson cleared his throat gently. "From a medical perspective, Miss Alvarez, this arrangement would be ideal for your condition. You'd have proper nutrition, a safe environment for your confinement, and immediate access to medical care when you need it. Frankly, trying to deliver a baby alone in this house would be challenging." The euphemism didn't hide the reality that Dr. Patterson was too tactful to state directly that, without help, both she and her baby could die during the birth. Maria had been trying not to think about that possibility, but it lurked in the back of her mind like a persistent shadow. "What exactly would my duties involve?" she asked, forcing herself to think practically rather than emotionally. "Nothing too strenuous, especially as your time gets closer," McCrae replied. "I have a cook who comes in twice a week, but I need someone to manage the day-to-day meals and keep the house organized. I also have paperwork that needs filing, correspondence that needs answering basic administrative tasks that I've been neglecting." It sounded almost too good to be true, and Maria's experience with things that seemed too good to be true had taught her to be cautious. "And after the baby comes?" "We'll figure that out when we get there," McCrae said simply. "One problem at a time." The practical part of Maria's mind was already cataloging the benefits: regular meals, safety, medical care, a chance to contribute meaningfully to her own survival. But another part of her, the part that had been hurt too deeply and too recently, whispered warnings about trusting in the kindness of men. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," McCrae replied, rising from his chair. "Take all the time you need." "But Maria," he paused, using her given name for only the second time, "don't let pride make a decision that could hurt you or your baby. Sometimes accepting help is the strongest thing you can do." After they left, Maria sat alone in her chair, staring into the dying fire and trying to sort through the tangle of emotions McCrae's offer had stirred up. The logical choice was obvious: accept his proposal and gain security for herself and her child. But logic had very little to do with the fear that accepting would somehow make her beholden in ways she couldn't yet understand. She thought of the portrait Dr. Patterson had mentioned, the painting of Elizabeth McCrae that supposedly hung in McCrae's study. What kind of woman had she been? Would she truly have wanted her husband to help a fallen woman? Or was McCrae simply telling himself comfortable stories to justify an impulse he didn't fully understand? And what did it mean that Maria found herself hoping, despite all reason and experience, that his motives were as pure as they seemed? Outside her window, An owl called from the cottonwood tree her father had planted when she was born, its voice carrying across the desert night like a prayer for wisdom she wasn't sure she possessed. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to trust in the kindness of a man she barely knew, or continue on the solitary path that had become her entire world. Tonight, she would allow herself to imagine what it might feel like to not be alone anymore. The baby stirred restlessly within her, as if sensing her agitation, and Maria placed both hands on her belly in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered into the darkness. "Should we take a chance on hope?" But if the baby had an opinion on the matter, it kept its counsel, leaving Maria to wrestle with the most important decision of her life as the night slowly gave way to dawn. Dawn brought clarity to Maria's troubled thoughts, as dawn sometimes does for those who have wrestled with difficult decisions through the long watches of the night. When she woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window and the baby announcing its wakefulness with a series of vigorous kicks, she knew what she had to do. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff in the faith that wings would appear before she hit the ground. But Maria had learned that sometimes faith was all you had, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. By the time she had dressed and prepared a simple breakfast, she could hear the sound of a wagon approaching along the dusty road that led to her house. When she looked out the window, she was not surprised to see Beau McRae climbing down from the driver's seat, his movements unhurried but purposeful. He knocked softly on her door, hat in hand, his gray eyes searching her face when she opened. Have you decided?" he asked without preamble, and Maria appreciated that he didn't pretend this was a casual social call. "Yes," she said simply. "I accept your offer." Something shifted in his expression, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction. "Good," he said. "I brought the wagon to help with your things." "I don't have much," Maria replied, gesturing to the small pile of belongings she had gathered during the morning. A carpet bag containing her few remaining clothes, her mother's sewing basket, the wooden cross from the wall, and the daguerreotype of her parents. Everything else she would leave behind, relics of a life that had already ended. McRae examined her meager possessions without comment, but she saw something flicker across his features that might have been anger on her behalf. It occurred to her that a man of his means probably couldn't imagine owning so little that it could fit in a single bag. "What about the house?" he asked as he loaded her things into the wagon bed. "I'll speak to the landlord. The rent is paid through the end of the month." Maria took one last look around the small rooms that had sheltered her through the worst period of her life. Despite everything, there had been moments of peace here, quiet evenings by the fire when she had felt almost content. Someone else will need it more than I do. The drive to McRae's ranch took them north of Socorro, through landscape that gradually transformed from the scrubby desert around town to rolling grassland dotted with cattle and crossed by clear-running streams. Maria had heard descriptions of the spread's size and prosperity, but seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. The ranch house sat on a rise overlooking miles of fenced pasture, a sprawling adobe structure that managed to be impressive without being ostentatious. Wide verandas wrapped around three sides of the building, providing shade and catching the prevailing breezes, while established cottonwoods and elms created islands of green in the vast landscape. As they approached the house, Maria could see ranch hands going about their daily tasks, mending fences, working horses in a large corral, tending to equipment. They looked up as the wagon passed, their gazes curious but respectful. Whatever McRae had told them about his new housekeeper, it was clear they had been instructed to treat her with courtesy. McCra helped her down from the wagon with the same careful consideration he had shown at her house, his hands warm and the hawi steady at her waist. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly enthusiastic kick, and Maria gasped softly, one hand moving instinctively to her belly. "Everything all right?" McRae asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Fine," Maria assured him with a rueful smile. "I think someone is excited about the new surroundings." Something softened in McRae's expression, and for a moment Maria thought he might say something about the baby, ask about its movements, or express curiosity about its expected arrival. Instead, he simply nodded and turned toward the house. "Come on," he said. "Let me show you around." The interior of the ranch house was even more impressive than its exterior, with high ceilings, whitewashed walls, and furniture that spoke of quality and comfort rather than mere display. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace, comfortable leather chairs, and shelves lined with books that looked well-read rather than decorative. But it was the smaller details that told the real story of the house's inhabitant. There were no fresh flowers, no feminine touches, no signs that anyone had taken care to make the space welcoming rather than merely functional. It was the home of a man who had stopped caring about such things, who lived here but didn't truly inhabit the space. "Your rooms are this way," McCrae said, leading her down a hallway lined with closed doors. He stopped before one near the end of the corridor and pushed it open, revealing a bedroom that was simple but comfortable, with windows that looked out over the ranch's gardens and a connecting door that led to a smaller chamber. "This will be the nursery," he said quietly, opening the second door to reveal an empty room flooded with morning sunlight. "When the time comes," the matter-of-fact way he said it, as if her baby's arrival were already an accepted part of the household's future, made Maria's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she managed. "McCrae." He nodded and moved back to the main bedroom, where he set her carpet bag on the bed. "The kitchen is at the back of the house, and there's an office where I do the ranch's paperwork. I'll show you those later, after you've had time to settle in." "When would you like me to start?" Maria asked, still overwhelmed by the reality of her new circumstances. "No hurry," McCrae replied. "Take today to get your bearings. Tomorrow will be soon enough to begin." He turned to go, then paused in the doorway. "Maria, there's one more thing you should know. My wife's portrait hangs in the study. Some people find it unsettling. I wanted to warn you." After he left, Maria sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. This morning, she had woken up in her tiny house, alone and uncertain about her future. Now she sat in a comfortable bedroom in one of the finest houses in the territory. With the promise of security for herself and her child Dot, it should have felt like a miracle. Instead, it felt like stepping into someone else's life, one that might be snatched away at any moment if she proved unworthy of it. Later that afternoon, after unpacking her few belongings and exploring her new quarters, curiosity finally overcame her reservations about intruding on McCrae's private spaces. The study was easy to find, a large room lined with ledgers and legal documents, dominated by a massive oak desk that looked like it had been built to last for generations. And there, hanging above the fireplace in a place of honor, was Elizabeth McCrae's portrait. Maria understood immediately why McCrae had warned her. The woman in the painting was breathtakingly beautiful, with golden hair and blue eyes that seemed to sparkle with life and humor. But more than beautiful, she looked beloved, the kind of woman who would have filled this house with laughter and warmth, who would have made it a home rather than just a place to live. She also looked nothing like Maria, where Elizabeth was. Fair and delicate, Maria was dark and strong-boned, where Elizabeth's painted smile suggested a woman accustomed to joy. Maria's experience had taught her that happiness was fragile and often fleeting. Looking at the portrait, Maria felt the full weight of what she had accepted. She wasn't just taking a job, she was stepping into the shadow of a perfect love, trying to fill a space that had been shaped by someone else entirely. The baby stirred restlessly within her, and Maria placed a protective hand over her belly. "I know," she whispered to her unborn child. "This is complicated, but we'll figure it out. We always do." That evening, she prepared her first meal in McCrae's kitchen, a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread that filled the house with savory aromas it probably hadn't known in years. When McCrae sat down at the long dining table that could have seated a dozen people, he ate with the appreciation of a man who had grown tired of his own cooking. "This is excellent," he said, and the simple compliment warmed Maria more than it should have. "Thank you. My mother taught me that food prepared with care nourishes more than just the body." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was. She would have liked this house. Maria looked around the spacious dining room with its heavy wooden furniture and hand-painted tiles. She always said that homes were meant to shelter love, not just people. McCrae's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Maria realized too late how her words might sound like criticism of his solitary existence, or worse, like a presumptuous suggestion about what this arrangement might become. "I'm sorry," she said. Quickly, "I didn't mean to, no," McCrae interrupted gently. "You're right. This house hasn't sheltered much love lately. Maybe it's time that changed." The words hung between them, weighted with possibilities that neither of them was quite ready to name. Outside, the sun was setting over the vast expanse of McCrae's land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Maria of the hope she was trying so hard not to feel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to this strange new life she had chosen. But tonight, for the first time in months, she would go to sleep knowing that she and her baby were safe, sheltered not just by adobe walls, but by the unexpected kindness of a man who understood what it meant to carry wounds that might never fully heal. In the study, Elizabeth McCrae's painted eyes seemed to watch over them all, bearing witness to the tentative beginning of something that might, with patience and care, grow into the kind of love that could fill even the largest house. With warmth, the rhythm of ranch life settled around Maria like a comfortable blanket over the following weeks. She woke each morning to the sound of cowboys calling to their horses and the distant lowing of cattle, sounds that spoke of purposeful work and lives lived in harmony with the land. It was a stark contrast to the whispered gossip and deliberate silences that had defined her existence in Socorro. Her duties as housekeeper proved less demanding than she had expected, partly because McCrae lived with the Spartan habits of a man who had trained himself not to need much, and partly because he seemed to go out of his way to ensure she wasn't overtaxed. The administrative work he had mentioned turned out to be genuine correspondence with cattle buyers, records of ranch expenses, filing of legal documents, but it was work that used her mind rather than just her hands, and she found herself looking forward to the quiet hours spent organizing his papers and drafting responses to business letters. Most evenings, they shared dinner at the long table in the dining room, their conversations gradually evolving from polite exchanges about the day's activities to something deeper and more personal. McCrae proved to be an excellent listener, drawing out stories of Maria's childhood with questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. It was during one such evening, as autumn began to paint the cottonwoods gold, and baby's movements had grown strong enough to be visible from the outside, that their conversation turned to the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. "You never talk about him," McCrae observed as they finished a meal of roasted chicken and vegetables from the ranch's garden. The baby's father. Maria's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where their child, for she had begun thinking of it as belonging to both of them in some indefinable way, was performing what felt like acrobatic feats. "There isn't much to say. He left before he knew about the baby. Did you love him?" The directness of the question should have shocked her, but she had grown accustomed to McCrae's way of cutting through social niceties to reach the heart of matters. "I thought I did. But I think what I loved was the idea of being loved, of having someone who would stay." McCrae nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his gray eyes. "And now? Now I know the difference between wanting someone to stay and trusting that they will." It was as close as either of them had come to acknowledging the feelings that had been growing between them, careful and tentative as desert flowers after rain. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with possibilities neither seemed quite ready to voice. That night, Maria lay in her comfortable bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch, settling into sleep, and allowed herself to imagine what it might be like if this arrangement became permanent. Not just the practical aspects, though the security for her child was more precious than gold, but the emotional ones. The quiet companionship, the shared meals, the way Mikra's presence made even the largest rooms feel warm and inhabited. It was a dangerous line of thinking, she knew. She was an employee here, not a wife, and the gap between those two positions was vast and unbridgeable. But in the darkness of her room, with the baby moving restlessly beneath her heart, she let herself dream of a future where she belonged here, not just as a convenience, but as a choice. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Maria was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed, followed by urgent voices on the front veranda. Through the window, she could see McCrae talking with one of his ranch hands, a young man whose agitated gestures suggested bad news. When McCrae entered the kitchen a few minutes later, his expression was grim. "There's been trouble in town," he said without preamble. "Someone's been asking questions about you." Maria felt the blood drain from her face. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest they know more about your past than they should. McCrae moved to the window and looked out across the ranch's peaceful landscape, but his stance suggested a man preparing for conflict. "Juan rode in from Socorro this morning. Says there's a stranger been asking about a pregnant woman who matches your description. Claims to be looking for his brother's girl." The words hit Maria like a physical blow, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen table for support. There was only one person who would describe her that way, only one person whose brother might have cause to seek her out. "Diego had a brother," she said quietly. "Esteban. I met him once briefly before Diego disappeared. He didn't approve of our arrangement." McCrae turned from the window, and Maria was struck by the change in his demeanor. Gone was the gentle rancher who had shared quiet dinners with her. In his place stood someone harder, more dangerous, someone who looked like he could indeed put 6 bullets through a playing card at 50 paces. "What does he want?" McCrae asked. "I don't know. I haven't seen or heard from anyone in Diego's family since he left. I assumed they had forgotten I existed." But even as she said it, Maria suspected she knew exactly what Esteban Morales wanted. Diego had been involved in something before he disappeared, something that had made him nervous and secretive in the weeks before he vanished. If his brother was looking for her now, it probably had less to do with family concern and more to do with unfinished business. McCrae must have seen something in her expression, because his voice gentled slightly. "Maria, is there something you're not telling me? Something about Diego that might explain why his brother would come looking for you now?" Maria hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect McCrae from troubles that weren't his and her growing trust in his ability to handle whatever challenges arose. In the end, honesty won out over caution. Diego was involved with some men who weren't respectable, she admitted. "I didn't know the details, but there were late-night meetings, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Money that he couldn't explain. I think he might have been mixed up in something illegal." McCrae's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of illegal? Cattle rustling, perhaps? Or smuggling? The border isn't far, and there are always men willing to move goods without asking too many questions about their origins." It was the first time Maria had spoken these suspicions aloud, and giving voice to them made them feel more real, more dangerous. She had spent months telling herself that Diego's secretiveness had been about other women or gambling debts, problems that had nothing to do with her. But deep down, she had always known it was something darker. "And you think his brother might believe you know something about these activities?" Maria nodded miserably. "It's possible. Diego and we were close. Esteban might think Diego confided in me, told me things that could be valuable to the right people, or dangerous to the wrong ones." She thought but didn't say that McCrae was quiet. For a long moment, and Maria could almost see him weighing options and calculating risks. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making difficult decisions. "You're not going back to town," he said firmly. "Not until we know what this man wants and whether he poses a threat." "I can't hide here forever," Maria protested. "And I won't be responsible for bringing danger to your ranch." "This is my ranch," McCrae replied with quiet steel in his voice. "I decide what risks are acceptable. And I won't have you facing this alone." The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through Maria's chest, even as her practical mind catalogued all the reasons why his protection might not be enough. Men like Esteban Morales didn't give up easily, and if he truly believed she possessed information valuable enough to make the journey from wherever he had been hiding, he would find a way to get to her eventually. But for now, in the bright kitchen of McCrae's ranch house, with the man himself standing between her and whatever threats the world might offer. Maria allowed herself to feel safe. It was a luxury she had almost forgotten existed, and she treasured it all the more for its probable brevity. "What do we do now?" she asked. McCrae moved to a cabinet and withdrew something that made Maria's breath catch, a gun belt and holster that looked well used and carefully maintained. As he strapped it around his waist with movements that spoke of long practice, Maria saw another glimpse of the man Mrs. Hernandez had warned her about, the former cavalry officer who had earned a reputation for being dangerous to cross. "Now we wait," he said simply, "and we prepare." Outside, the peaceful sounds of ranch life continued, horses nickering, cattle calling, men going about their daily work. But underneath it all, Maria could feel the tension of approaching storm, the electric pressure that comes before lightning splits the sky. Whatever Esteban Morales wanted, whatever secrets Diego might have carried to his grave in the desert, Maria was no longer facing them alone. For the first time since discovering Diego's abandonment, she had someone willing to stand with her against whatever darkness pursued her. It should have been enough to ease her fears. Instead, it only made her more aware of how much she had to lose if the past finally caught up with her present. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her agitation, and Maria pressed both hands to her belly in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "We're safe here. We're protected." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true, or simply what she needed to believe in order to get through whatever was coming. 2 days after the news of Esteban Morales' arrival in Socorro, the truth about Diego's disappearance came to light in a way that shattered every assumption Maria had built about her past. She was in McCrae's study, organizing correspondence and trying to distract herself from the constant worry that gnawed at her thoughts when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the ranch house. Through the window, she could see McCrae striding across the yard from the stables, his hand resting casually on his gun butt in a gesture that had become habitual since learning of the threat. But the riders who emerged from the dust weren't the danger they had been expecting. Instead, Maria recognized the weathered face of Sheriff Morrison from Socorro, accompanied by 2 men she didn't know, one wearing a deputy's badge, the other dressed in the practical clothes of a working man. McCrae met them on the front veranda, and through the open window, Maria could hear the low murmur of their conversation without making out specific words. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious enough to keep them talking for nearly a quarter of an hour before McCrae finally led them into the house. "Maria," he called from the front room, "could you join us, please?" The formal tone of his voice sent a chill down her spine, but she set aside her work and made her way to where the men waited, hat in hand, with the grave expressions of bearers of difficult news. "Miss Alvarez," Sheriff Morrison said, nodding respectfully. "I apologize for the intrusion, but we have some information that concerns you directly." Maria lowered herself carefully into the chair McCrae indicated, her hand instinctively moving to cradle her belly. The baby had been restless all morning, as if picking up on her anxiety, and she found comfort in the familiar weight of it beneath her palm. "What kind of information?" she asked. The sheriff glanced at his companions, then withdrew a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Yesterday, we had occasion to search the belongings of a man who died in our jail fellow named Esteban Morales." Maria's breath caught. "Died? How?" "Heart gave out, according to Doc Patterson. Seems he'd been living hard for a long time, and his body finally just quit on him." Sheriff Morrison unfolded the paper with careful precision. "But before he passed, he managed to tell us quite a story, and we found this among his things." He held up what appeared to be a wanted poster, yellowed with age and travel worn. Even from across the room, Maria could make out the familiar features sketched in black ink, though the name beneath the drawing made her heart stop. Diego Santana. The sheriff read aloud. "Wanted for cattle rustling, armed robbery, and the murder of 2 men during a failed bank robbery in Albuquerque. Reward of $500 for information leading to his capture, dead or alive." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that filled the room. Maria stared at the poster, trying to reconcile the smiling, charming man she had known with the cold-eyed criminal in the sketch. "That's not possible," she said weakly. "His name was Diego Morales, not Santana. And he couldn't have been a murderer." The third man, whom she now realized must be some kind of lawman despite his civilian clothes, spoke for the first time. "Ma'am, I'm Marshal Tom Bradley, out of Santa Fe. I've been tracking Diego Santana for the better part of 3 years. The man you knew as Diego Morales was indeed Diego Santana, and he was one of the most wanted men in the territory." Maria felt the world tilt around her, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had suddenly become quicksand. Everything she thought. She knew about Diego, their courtship, their love affair. Even the circumstances of his abandonment had been built on lies. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would he? What could he have wanted with me?" Marshal Bradley's expression softened with what might have been pity. "According to his brother, Santana was planning to use you as cover while he moved stolen goods through Socorro. A man with a pregnant girlfriend looks like he's settling down, less likely to attract suspicion from the law." The casual cruelty of it hit Maria like a physical blow. She had given Diego her heart, her body, her trust, and he had seen her as nothing more than a convenient disguise for his criminal activities. "There's more," Sheriff Morrison said gently. "Esteban told us that Diego didn't abandon you by choice. He was killed during a dispute with his partners over the division of their last score. They buried him somewhere in the desert west of town." Maria closed her eyes, trying to process this final revelation. For months, she had alternated between hating Diego for his abandonment and hoping against hope that he might return to her. Now she learned that he had been dead almost as long as she had been mourning him, killed not by accident or illness, but by the very criminals he had chosen to associate with. "Miss Alvarez," Marshal Bradley continued, "we have reason to believe that some of Diego's former associates think he might have hidden stolen goods or money somewhere before his death. Esteban came to Socorro looking for you because they believe Diego might have told you where these items are hidden." "But I don't know anything," Maria protested. "Diego never told me about any stolen goods or money. If he had hidden something, I would have found it by now. God knows I've needed it badly enough." "We believe you," the marshal said. "But the problem is, his former partners don't. They think you're lying, protecting his secrets. And they're not the kind of men who take no for an answer." McCrae, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, finally spoke. "How many men are we talking about?" "At least 3, possibly more," Marshal Bradley replied. "They call themselves the Santana Gang, though Diego himself is obviously no longer with them. They've been laying low since his death, but Esteban's failure to return with information has apparently convinced them to take a more direct approach." "Which means—" McCrae's voice was deceptively calm, but Maria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his weapon. "Which means they're probably on their way here," Sheriff Morrison said bluntly. "Esteban had time to tell them about your ranch before he died. They know where to find Miss Alvarez now." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the sound of Maria's heart pounding in her ears. She thought of the peaceful weeks she had spent here, the growing sense of safety and belonging, the hope she had allowed herself to feel for the future. All of it built on sand, apparently, ready to be swept away by the tide of Diego's past sins. "When?" McCrae asked. "Hard to say," the marshal replied. "Could be today, could be next week. But they will come. Men like that don't give up on $5,000 in stolen money. 5,000? Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "The proceeds from their last robbery," Sheriff Morrison explained. "A bank in Las Cruces. Diego disappeared with the money right after the job, which is why. His partners killed him, but they never found where he hid it." Maria pressed both hands to her temples, trying to make sense of the nightmare her life had suddenly become. Not only had the man she loved been a lie, but his lies were about to destroy the new life she had worked so hard to build. "I'm sorry, Miss Alvarez," Marshal Bradley said, and his sympathy seemed genuine. "I know this is a lot to take in, but you needed to know what you're facing. What are our options?" McCrae asked, and Maria noticed that he said "our" without hesitation, as if her troubles had automatically become his own. "You could leave," Sheriff Morrison suggested. Get Miss Alvarez out of the territory entirely, somewhere these men can't. Find her. No. The word came out harder than Maria had intended, but she didn't soften it. I won't run again. I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when the past will catch up with me. McCrae nodded approvingly. What's the alternative? Marshal Bradley exchanged glances with the sheriff before answering. We could set a trap. Use Miss Alvarez as bait to draw them out, then arrest them when they come calling. Absolutely not, McCrae said before Maria could respond. I won't have her used as bait, especially not in her condition. It might be the only way to end this, the marshal pointed out. These men won't give up just because she claims not to know anything. They'll keep coming until they're satisfied or dead. Maria looked around the room at the four men discussing her fate and felt a familiar surge of the stubbornness that had carried her through every crisis in her life. She was tired of being the victim of other people's choices, tired of having her destiny decided by men who saw her as either a pawn or a prize. I'll do it, she said quietly, and the conversation stopped as all eyes turned to her. Maria, no, McCrae began, but she held up a hand to silence him. This is my choice to make, she said with quiet dignity. Diego's lies put me in this position, but I won't let his crimes define the rest of my life. If facing these men is what it takes to be free of the past, then that's what I'll do. She looked at McCrae, seeing the fear and anger warring in his gray eyes, and felt her heart clench with love for this man who had already given her so much. But I won't do it alone, she added, not if you're willing to stand with me. McCrae's answer was immediate and unwavering. Always. As the four men began discussing the details of their trap, Maria felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring danger, violence, perhaps even death. But it would also bring resolution, one way or another. She had spent too many months living in the shadow of Diego's abandonment, defined by his choices rather than her own. Now, finally, she would have the chance to write the ending to this story herself. The baby stirred within her, and Maria placed a protective hand over her belly. Whatever happened in the coming confrontation, she would face it as she had faced everything else, with courage, dignity, and the unshakable determination to protect those she loved. Even if it killed her Dot, the plan they devised was both simple and terrifying in its implications. Maria would remain at the ranch, visible and apparently unprotected, while McCrae and his men prepared defensive positions around the property. Sheriff Morrison and Marshal Bradley would position themselves in the hills overlooking the ranch house, ready to move in once the criminals revealed themselves. It was a sound strategy, McCrae assured her, one that took advantage of the ranch's natural defenses and his men's intimate knowledge of the terrain. But as Maria lay in her bed that night, feeling the baby's restless movements echoing her own anxiety, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial, some element that would turn their careful plans into disaster. Morning brought an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into Maria's bones despite the warmth of the kitchen fire. She moved through her usual routine, preparing breakfast, organizing McCrae's correspondence, tending to the household tasks that had become as natural as breathing. But everything felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that this might be her last day of peace. McCrae appeared in the kitchen doorway as she was cleaning the breakfast dishes, his service revolver strapped to his hip and a rifle cradled in his arms. The sight of him armed for war sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. The men are in position, he said quietly. Tom and Jake are watching the main approach from the hills. Sam and Miguel have the eastern pasture covered, and old Pete is keeping an eye on the back trail. Maria nodded, though the names of his ranch hands blurred together in her mind. She had met them all in passing during her weeks at the ranch, decent men who worked hard and asked few questions. Now they were risking their lives for her sake, and the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. What about Sheriff Morrison and the marshal? They're in place on the ridge overlooking the house. Good sight lines, clear fields of fire. McCrae set his rifle against the kitchen table and moved closer, his gray eyes searching her face. Maria, it's not too late to change your mind. We could still get you away from here, find somewhere safe to wait until this is over. And then, What? Maria asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Hide for the rest of my life? Raise my child in the shadow of Diego's crimes? No. This ends today, one way or another. McCrae reached out and touched her cheek with fingers that were gentle, despite the calluses earned from years of hard work. You're the strongest woman I've ever known, he said softly. Stronger than Elizabeth, though I never thought I'd say such a thing about anyone. The comparison to his late wife should have stung, but instead it filled Maria with a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen fire. To be mentioned in the same breath as the woman he had loved so deeply was a honor she hadn't dared hope for. She would have understood, Maria said, covering his hand with her own. What we're doing today, I mean. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the cost might be everything. Yes, McCrae agreed, his voice rough with emotion. She would have understood that too. The moment stretched between them, heavy with words unspoken and feelings too dangerous to voice with death riding toward them across the desert. Maria wanted to tell him that she loved him, that these weeks at his ranch had shown her what real partnership could look like, that she dreamed of a future where they could build something lasting together. Instead, she simply said, "Be careful. Oh, come back to me." Always, he replied, the single word carrying the weight of a promise. The waiting was the hardest part. After McCrae left to take up his position in the ranch house's upper windows, Maria found herself alone with nothing but her thoughts and the increasingly active baby, who seemed to sense the tension radiating from her body. She tried to maintain her normal routine, but concentration proved impossible when every sound might herald the arrival of violent men intent on extracting information she didn't possess. It was just past noon when she heard the first shots. Crack of rifle fire echoed across the ranch's peaceful landscape like thunder in a clear sky, followed immediately by the thunder of hoofbeats and shouted commands. Maria's blood turned to ice as she realized the sounds were coming from multiple directions, not the single approach they had planned for, but a coordinated attack from several points. Through the kitchen window, she could see muzzle flashes from the hills, where Tom and Jake were supposed to be watching the main approach. Either the criminals had found the ranch hand's position, or worse, they had eliminated them and were now using their vantage point to rain fire down on the ranch house. The baby kicked violently, and Maria gasped as a sharp pain shot through her belly. Not now, she thought desperately. Not in the middle of this, but her body seemed to have its own ideas about timing. Another contraction followed the first, stronger and longer, and Maria realized with dawning horror that her child had chosen this moment of all moments, to make its entrance into the world. "Bo!" she called out, but her voice was lost in the chaos of gunfire and shouting that had erupted around the ranch. Through the windows, she could see smoke rising from one of the outbuildings, and the acrid smell of burning wood began to filter into the house. Another contraction gripped her, this one strong enough to double her over and force her to grab the kitchen table for support. The baby was coming, whether she was ready or not, whether it was safe or not, whether there were armed men trying to kill everyone she cared about or not. Upstairs, she could hear McCrae returning fire, the sharp reports of his rifle punctuated by the crash of breaking glass as bullets found the ranch house windows. The battle was joined in earnest now, and Maria was caught in the middle of it, with no way to help and no way to escape. She managed to make it to her bedroom, each step a struggle against the increasing intensity of her labor pains. The connecting door to what was supposed to be the nursery stood open, and she could see the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that McCrae had prepared for a child who might now be born into a world of violence and death. Another shot shattered the bedroom window, sending glass cascading across the floor in glittering fragments. Maria crouched beside the bed, one hand pressed to her belly and the other covering her head as more bullets whistled overhead. The sounds of battle were getting closer now, and she could hear voices shouting in Spanish crude, violent words that spoke of men pushed beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. These weren't just criminals looking for hidden money anymore. They were killers who had come too far to turn back empty-handed. "Where is she?" The voice was close enough, too, be coming from just outside her window, and Maria recognized the accent, even though she had never heard this particular speaker before. Find the woman. She has to know where Diego hid the money. Maria bit down on her lip to keep from crying out as another contraction tore through her. The baby was coming fast now, too fast for her to do anything but endure the pain and pray that someone would survive this nightmare to help her when the time came. The bedroom door burst open, and Maria's heart stopped as she expected to see one of Diego's former partners standing in the doorway with murder in his eyes. Instead, it was McCrae, his face grim and his shirt torn by what looked like a bullet graze across his shoulder. Maria! He was beside her in an instant, his rifle forgotten as he took in her condition. The baby is it? Coming now, Maria gasped between contractions. Can't stop it. McCrae's face went white, but his hands were steady as he helped her onto the bed. Mrs. Santos, he said, as if thinking aloud. We need Mrs. Santos. She's in town, Maria reminded him through gritted teeth, miles away. Outside, the gunfire was intensifying, and Maria could hear new voices joining the battle reinforcements arriving, though she couldn't tell if they were friends or enemies. The sound seemed to be moving around the house now, as if the attackers were trying to surround the building completely. I have to get back, McCrae said, anguish clear in his voice. The men are counting on me, but I can't leave you like this. Go, Maria said firmly, even as another contraction made her vision blur with pain. I'll manage. I have to. Maria. Go, she said again, more forcefully this time. Your men need you. The baby and I will be all right. We have to be. McCrae hesitated for one more moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. Then he leaned down and kissed her forehead with infinite tenderness. I love you, he said simply, the words she had been longing to hear finally spoken at the worst possible moment. I should have said it sooner. I love you too, Maria whispered back. Now go. Win this fight. Come back to us. McCrae grabbed his rifle and headed for the door, pausing only to look back at her one more time. You're the strongest woman I know. He said, you can do this. Then he was gone, leaving Maria alone with her pain and her fear and the sound of bullets. Tearing apart the peaceful world they had tried to build together, another contraction gripped her, stronger than any before. And Maria realized that, ready or not, her child was about to be born into a world at war. She pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her cries, and prepared to do what women had been doing since the beginning of time, bringing new life into an uncertain world through sheer force of will and the desperate hope that love would be enough to see them through. Outside, the battle for their future raged on, but in the bedroom of the ranch house, another kind of battle was just beginning. And this one, Maria was determined to win. The battle outside reached a crescendo just as Maria's labor entered its final, most desperate stage. Through the broken bedroom window, she could hear McCrae's rifle speaking with deadly precision, each shot carefully placed and deliberately timed. His military training was evident in the methodical way he engaged the attackers. But even his skill couldn't mask the fact that they were badly outnumbered. Maria gripped the bedsheets with white-knuckled hands as another contraction tore through her body, this one so intense it left her gasping for breath. The baby was coming whether the world was ready or not, and she found herself caught between the primal urgency of birth and the very real possibility that neither she nor her child would survive the next hour. Come on, little one, she whispered. Between contractions, her voice barely audible over the chaos outside. We need to do this together. We need to be strong. The sound of splintering wood from somewhere in the house made her heart race with fresh terror. They were inside now. Diego's former associates had breached the ranch house's defenses and were searching room by room. She could hear heavy footsteps in the hallway, punctuated by the crash of furniture being overturned and doors being kicked. Open. She's got to be here somewhere. The voice was harsh, desperate, belonging to a man who had come too far to accept failure. Diego's woman. Find her. Maria pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her breathing, even as her body betrayed her with another powerful contraction. The baby was crowning now. She could feel it, and there was no stopping what had been set in motion hours ago in the peaceful kitchen. where she had shared what might be her last normal morning with Beau. The bedroom door rattled as someone tested the handle. Maria had managed to lock it before collapsing onto the bed, but she knew a simple lock wouldn't hold determined men for long. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might serve as a weapon, but her condition made fighting impossible, even if she had possessed the strength for it. "Locked," came a voice from the hallway. "She's in there. Break it down." The first impact against the door sent splinters flying from the frame. Maria bit down hard on the pillow as another contraction overwhelmed her, and in that moment of overwhelming pain and terror, she felt something shift inside her. The baby was coming now, in this moment. Ready or not, a second impact loosened the door's hinges, and Maria could see light from the hallway beginning to show through the widening gaps in the frame. She had perhaps seconds before they broke through. Seconds to make peace with whatever was about to happen. But instead of despair, she found herself filled with a fierce, protective rage that cut through her pain like a blade. These men had taken Diego from her through their violence and greed. They had shattered her illusions and forced her to flee the only home she had known. Now they dared to threaten her child, the innocent life that had done nothing but exist. Asterisk, no. She said aloud, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Not my baby. You will not hurt my baby." The third impact shattered the door completely, and 3 men burst into the room with guns drawn and murder in their eyes. The first was tall and lean with a face marked by old knife scars. The second was heavyset with the cruel eyes of a man who enjoyed causing pain. And the third made Maria's blood run cold with recognition. She had seen him only once before, but his face was burned into her memory. This was the man who had come to her house late one night when Diego still lived there. The man whose whispered conversation with her lover had filled her with unspoken dread. "Well, well," the scarred man said, lowering his gun slightly as he took in her condition. "Looks like Diego's little Puta is about to drop her bastard. Where is it?" The heavy man demanded, his weapon still trained on her. Where did Diego hide the money? Maria tried to speak, to tell them once again that she knew nothing about any hidden money, but another contraction chose that moment to grip her with relentless force. The baby was coming, would not be denied, and she found herself caught between the desperate need to push and the equally desperate need to convince these killers that she posed no threat to them. "She can't talk," the third man observed with clinical detachment. "Having the baby right now." "Good," the scarred man said with a cruel smile. "That means she can't run. We've got all the time in the world to get answers." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway, not the heavy boots of more criminals, but the familiar stride of someone Maria knew as well as her own heartbeat. "Maria!" McCrae's voice cut through the chaos like a cavalry bugle, and the 3 men spun toward the doorway with their weapons raised. What happened next seemed to unfold in the space between one heartbeat and the next. McCrae appeared in the ruined doorway with his rifle at his shoulder, and in that instant, Maria saw him not as the gentle rancher who had shared quiet dinners with her, but as the cavalry officer who had earned his deadly reputation in 100 battles. The first shot took the heavy man in the chest, spinning him around and sending his gun flying from nerveless fingers. The second caught the third man, Diego's former associate, before he could bring his weapon to bear, the bullet finding its mark with the precision that had made McCrae a legend among his former comrades. The scarred man managed to get off a wild shot that splintered the wooden headboard inches from Maria's head before McCrae's third bullet ended his threat permanently. In the sudden silence that followed, broken only by the sound of gunpowder smoke drifting through the afternoon, Maria felt her body surrender completely to the process that had been building all day. With a cry that contained equal parts pain and triumph, she felt her child finally slip into the world. The baby's first cry pierced the air like a tiny trumpet announcing victory over all the forces that had tried to prevent this moment. It was the most beautiful sound Maria had ever heard, proof of life, proof of hope, proof that love could indeed triumph over violence and fear. McCrae was beside her in an instant, his rifle forgotten, as he knelt by the bed with hands that shook despite all his years of handling life and death situations. Maria, he breathed, his voice filled with wonder as he looked down at the tiny, red-faced creature that had just entered their world. Maria, you did it. We did it, she corrected weakly, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. We all did it. The baby is son, she realized, as McCrae carefully helped her gather the child to her chest, continued to announce. His presence with lusty cries that spoke of strong lungs and an even stronger will to live. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and as Maria looked down at his tiny face, she felt something settle into place in her heart that she hadn't even realized was broken. Outside, she could hear voices calling McCrae's men, reporting that the threat had been eliminated, that the ranch was secure. Sheriff Morrison and Marshal Bradley would be arriving soon to clean up the aftermath and file their reports. But for now, in this moment, there was only the three of them, Maria, Bo, and the tiny new life they had protected with everything they had. The baby whose first cry had cut through gunfire and announced that hope, after all, was stronger than hate. What will you call him? McCrae asked softly, his finger gently touching the baby's tiny fist. Maria looked up at the man who had stood with her through the darkest moments of her life, who had fought for her and her child without question or hesitation, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude and love. Hope, she said simply. His name is Hope. In the immediate aftermath of the gunfight, as Maria cradled her newborn son against her chest, and McCrae knelt beside the bed with wonder written across his weathered features, the sound of approaching voices reminded them that their private miracle was taking place in the middle of a very public crisis. Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway first, his gun drawn and his face grim with the expectation of finding more violence. Instead, he stopped short at the sight of Maria holding her baby, his expression shifting from alertness to amazement in the space of a heartbeat. Well, I'll be damned, he said softly, holstering his weapon. Is everyone all right in here? Better than all right, McCrae replied, his voice rough with emotion as he reached out to touch the baby's tiny hand. We have a new citizen of New Mexico Territory. Marshal Bradley joined the sheriff in the doorway, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. The three dead criminals lay where they had fallen, their threat ended permanently, but the focus of everyone in the room was on the tiny life that had entered the world in the midst of chaos. Mrs. Santos is on her way, the marshal reported. One of the ranch hands rode for town as soon as the shooting started. She should be here within the hour. Maria felt a wave of relief at the news. While the birth had gone smoothly considering the circumstances, she knew that both she and the baby would benefit from the midwife's experienced care. Hope was breathing well and seemed healthy, but she wanted professional confirmation that he had suffered no ill effects from his dramatic entrance into the world. The others? McCrae asked, though his attention remained focused on Maria and the baby. All accounted for, Sheriff Morrison replied. Tom and Jake are fine. They managed to take cover when the shooting started and picked off two of the gang from their position in the hills. Sam took a bullet in the arm, but Doc Patterson says it's clean and should heal without trouble. The rest of your men are shaken but unharmed. And the criminals? 6 total, Marshal Bradley said, consulting a small notebook. 3 here, 2 more outside, and 1 who tried to escape on horseback but didn't make it past the north pasture. It's over, Miss Alvarez. Diego's former associates won't be bothering anyone ever again. The finality of those words settled over Maria like a benediction. For months, she had lived with the shadow of Diego's abandonment hanging over her life, wondering what had become of him and fearing that his past might someday catch up with her. Now she knew the truth, all of it, and that truth, however painful, had set her free. There's something else, the marshal continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. We found this on the body of their leader, a man named Carlos Vega. He withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked familiar even before he opened it. Maria recognized Diego's handwriting immediately, though the words written there were not meant for her eyes. It's a letter, Marshal Bradley explained. Apparently, written by Diego shortly before his death. Vega had been carrying it for months, trying to decipher what it meant. McCrae took the letter and read it silently, his expression growing thoughtful. "It's addressed to you, Maria," he said gently. "Diego wrote it for you." With trembling hands, Maria accepted the paper while adjusting little Hope against her shoulder. The baby had settled into peaceful sleep, exhausted by his dramatic entry into the world, and his steady breathing provided a calming counterpoint to the chaos of her emotions. The letter was brief, written in the hasty scrawl of a man who knew. His time was running short. "Mi querida Maria, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and my sins have finally caught up with me. I know you must hate me for leaving without explanation, but the truth is I never had a choice. The men I was involved with discovered my plans to disappear with you, to start fresh somewhere far from this life of violence and crime. I want you to know that everything between us was real. My love for you, my dreams of our future together, none of that was a lie, even though everything else was. You deserved so much better than what I could give you, but I was selfish enough to take what happiness I could steal. There is money hidden beneath the floor of the old mission, ruins 5 miles south of Socorro. Not stolen money, my own savings. From before I fell in with these men. I meant it for our new life together, but now it must serve to secure your future without me. Forgive me, if you can. Forget me, if you must. But know that in whatever hell awaits men like me, the memory of your love will be the only light I carry. Con te do me amor." Diego Maria read the letter twice, tears blurring her vision as she finally understood the full scope of Diego's deception and his genuine feelings for her. He had been a criminal, yes, and a liar about almost everything. But his love for her had been real, and in the end, he had died trying to protect her from the consequences of his choices. "The money he mentioned," Sheriff Morrison said quietly, "it's legitimate. We checked. About $2,000 in gold and silver, enough to ensure you and the baby will never want for anything. $2,000. It was a fortune by any measure, enough to secure Hope's future and give Maria choices she had never dared dream of." But as she looked down at her sleeping son, and then up at McCrae's gentle face, she realized that the greatest treasure in her life couldn't be measured in gold. "What will you do now?" Marshal Bradley asked. Maria considered the question, holding her son close and feeling the solid presence of McCrae beside her. For the first time in her adult life, she had real choices to make, decisions that weren't driven by desperation or survival, but by hope and possibility. "I don't know," she said honestly. "For so long, I've been focused on just getting through each day that I haven't allowed myself to think about what I actually want from life." McCrae reached over and gently touched Hope's tiny head, his large hand incredibly gentle against the baby's downy hair. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "You've both been through enough for one day." As if summoned by his words, the sound of a wagon approaching at speed announced Mrs. Santos' arrival. Within minutes, the experienced midwife had taken charge of the situation with the no-nonsense efficiency that had seen her through hundreds of births over the years. "Out," she commanded the men with good-natured authority. "All of you. This is women's work now." As Sheriff Morrison and Marshal Bradley filed out to complete their investigation, McCrae lingered for a moment longer, his eyes meeting Maria's across the small space that separated them. "Thank you," Maria said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything he had done for her. The shelter, the protection, the love he had offered without condition or expectation. "Thank you," McCrae replied, his gaze moving to encompass both her and the baby, for letting me be part of this, for giving me a reason to hope again. In the charred remains of what had once been Diego's final letter to her, Maria found not just closure, but understanding. Diego's love had been real but flawed, built on deception, and ultimately destroyed by his inability to escape his past. But the love she saw in McCrae's eyes was different, honest, steady, and strong enough to build a future on. As Mrs. Santos began her examination of both mother and child, Maria allowed herself to imagine what that future might look like. A future where Hope would grow up knowing the love of two parents, where the shadows of the past would give way to the bright promise of tomorrow. Outside, the sun was setting over the ranch that had become her sanctuary, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and beginnings in equal measure. The battle was over, the enemies defeated, and hope, in the form of a tiny baby, and the promise of love had triumphed over all the forces arrayed against it. For the first time in her life, Maria Alvarez was truly free to choose her own destiny, and she knew exactly what that choice would be. 6 months after the day that had changed everything, Maria stood on the wide veranda of the ranch house, watching her son sleep peacefully in the wooden cradle that McCrae had crafted with his own hands. Hope had grown strong and healthy, his dark eyes alert and curious about the world around him, his smile quick to appear whenever he saw the face of the man he had already learned to associate with safety and love. The morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and green, illuminating the vast expanse of McCrae land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. It was a view that never failed to fill Maria with wonder, not just at the beauty of it, but at the knowledge that this was now her home, truly and completely, in ways that had nothing to do with employment or charity and everything to do with love freely given and joyfully received. Mrs. Santos had declared both mother and child perfectly healthy within days of Hope's dramatic birth, but it had taken weeks for Maria to fully process everything that had happened in those few terrifying hours. The death of Diego's criminal associates had freed her from the shadow of the past, but it was Diego's final letter that had truly allowed her to let go of the guilt and regret she had carried for so long. The money he had hidden near the old mission ruins had indeed proven legitimate, his own savings, carefully accumulated over years before he had fallen in with the wrong companions. Maria had retrieved it with McCrae's help, but the financial security it represented was far less important than the peace of mind that came with finally understanding Diego's true feelings for her. He had loved her in his flawed and desperate way, but his love had been built on deception and sustained by lies, ultimately destroyed by his inability to escape the violent world he had chosen. It was a tragedy, but it was his tragedy, not hers. She could mourn what might have been without allowing it to define what could still be. What could still be had turned out to be more beautiful than any dream she had dared entertain during those dark months of uncertainty and fear. 3 months after Hope's birth, on a crisp autumn morning when the cottonwoods were dressed in gold and the air carried the promise of winter, Beau McCrae had asked her to marry him, not out of duty or obligation, not because she needed his protection or he needed her services, but because somewhere in the space between her arrival as a desperate employee and her transformation into an essential part of his life, they had fallen completely and irrevocably in love. The proposal had come as they sat together on this same veranda, Hope sleeping between them, and the vast New Mexico sky stretching endlessly overhead. McCrae had been quiet all morning, and Maria had begun to worry that something was troubling him, when he suddenly turned to her with an expression of nervous determination that she had never seen on his confident face. "Maria," he had said, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever your answer is, it won't change anything about your place here. You and Hope will always have a home at this ranch, always have my protection, and my friendship, regardless of what you say to what I'm about to ask." The careful preamble had made her heart race with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. "What is it, Beau?" He had reached into his pocket and withdrawn a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single diamond that caught the morning light like captured starfire. It was nothing like the elaborate jewelry she had sometimes glimpsed in shop windows in Socorro, but it was perfect in its elegant simplicity. "Will you marry me?" he had asked, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Not because you need my name or my protection, but because I love you and hope more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone again. Because I want to spend whatever years I have left making you happy, if you'll let me." Maria's answer had been immediate and came from the deepest part of her heart. "Yes," she had whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at this man who had given her so much more than shelter and security. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The wedding itself had taken place 2 weeks later in the small church in Socorro, where Maria had worshipped since childhood. Father Miguel had performed the ceremony with obvious joy, and even Mrs. Hernandez from the general store had attended with what appeared to be genuine happiness for the couple's good fortune. It had been a simple affair by the standards of wealthy ranchers, but it had felt like the most magnificent celebration Maria could imagine. She had worn her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved through all the years of hardship, and carried wildflowers picked from the ranch's meadows. McCrae had worn his best suit and looked so handsome that Maria's heart had stuttered when she first saw him waiting for her at the altar. But the most precious moment had come when Father Miguel had asked if anyone objected to the union. In the brief silence that followed, Hope had chosen that exact instant to let out a small cry from Mrs. Santos's arms, as if adding his own tiny voice of approval to the proceedings. The congregation had erupted in gentle laughter, and Maria had known with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Now, as she looked down at her sleeping son and caught sight of the wedding ring that adorned her left hand, simple but genuine, representing a love that was equally simple and genuine, Maria marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The woman who had stood before the town barber 6 months ago, desperate enough to sell her hair for survival, was gone. In her place stood Maria McCrae, wife and mother, partner and beloved, a woman who had learned that strength sometimes meant accepting help, and that love sometimes meant taking the risk of being hurt again. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and her heart lifted as it always did when she saw McCrae walking toward her. He had been out checking on the cattle with his men, and dust from the trail still clung to his boots and hat. But his face lit up with the smile that was reserved only for her and Hope, the expression that never failed to make her feel like the most treasured woman in the world. "How are my 2 favorite people?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her forehead before examining their son with the careful attention he gave to everything he loved. "Perfect," Maria replied, meaning it completely. "We're perfect." McCrae straightened and pulled her gently into his arms, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby. "I have news," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of excitement that made Maria look up at him curiously. "What kind of news?" "The railroad is coming through this part of the territory next year. That means Socorro is going to grow, probably double or triple in size. Good for business, good for the ranch." He paused, his expression growing tender. "And good for Hope's future. He'll grow up in a world with more opportunities than either of us could have imagined." Maria smiled at the thought of their son, for she thought of Hope as theirs now, completely and without reservation, growing up in a world of expanding possibilities. "He'll make the most of whatever opportunities come his way," she said confidently. "He's got his father's determination and his mother's stubbornness." "God help us all," McCrae said with a laugh, but his eyes were warm with love and pride. As they stood together on the veranda, holding each other and watching over their sleeping child, Maria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. It had been marked by loss and betrayal, fear and desperate choices, moments when she had wondered if she would survive to see another sunrise. But it had also been marked by unexpected kindness, by love that appeared when she had least expected it, by the discovery that some people could be trusted with your heart and your future and your children. It had been marked, ultimately, by hope, the same hope that now slept peacefully in the cradle beside them, living proof that even the darkest circumstances could give birth to light. "Do you ever regret it?" McCrae asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Any of it? The path that brought you here?" Maria considered the question seriously, as she considered all of his questions. The pain had been real, the fear genuine, the losses devastating. But without those experiences, she would never have found her way to this veranda, this man, this life that felt like coming home to a place she had never known she was seeking. "No," she said finally, with the certainty of a woman who had learned to distinguish between love and illusion. "I don't regret any of it. Every step led me here, to you, to us. How could I regret the path that brought me home?" McCrae's arms tightened around her, and Maria knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. She had learned that love wasn't just about passion or romance or grand gestures, though it could encompass all of those things. Real love was about choosing each other every day, about building something lasting from the raw. Materials of trust and commitment and shared dreams dot as the sun climbed higher over the ranch that was now her home. Maria McCrae held her husband close and watched their son sleep, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The woman who had sold her hair for survival had found something far more valuable than money or security. She had found love that would last a lifetime and hope that would endure for generations to come.